During fourth period, my phone buzzed. If you're reading this, I'm already inside. I stared at the message from the unknown number while Mr. Kelsey droned on about the Treaty of Versailles. My stomach dropped because we'd all gotten the email last month about the expelled student who'd threatened to come back. Derek Paulson had been kicked out for bringing a knife to school and telling his ex-girlfriend he'd make her regret leaving him. The administration sent a mass email assuring parents they'd increased security, but everyone knew our school had 2 rent-a-cops who spent most of their time confiscating vapes. I showed the text to my best friend Nina sitting next to me and watched her face go pale. She grabbed my wrist hard enough to hurt and whispered that we needed to tell someone right now because this wasn't a joke. Mr. Kelsey noticed us whispering and asked if we had something to share with the class. Nina stood up without asking permission and said someone just texted a threat about being inside the school. The classroom went dead silent, and you could see panic spreading across faces like dominoes falling. Mr. Kelsey's hand shook as he reached for the phone on his desk to call the office. But before he could dial, the fire alarm started blaring. Everyone knew the protocol was to evacuate during fire alarms, but something felt wrong about leaving the classroom when someone had just threatened to be inside the building. Half the students jumped up and headed for the door while the other half froze in their seats looking at Mr. Kelsey for guidance. He told us to wait and tried calling the office, but nobody answered. The alarm kept wailing, and through the classroom window, I could see students pouring out of other buildings into the courtyard. Mr. Kelsey made a decision and said we should evacuate to our designated area, but stay together as a group and move quickly. We filed into the hallway, and that's when I saw him. Derek Paulson was standing at the far end of the corridor near the stairwell, wearing a black jacket with his hands in his pockets. Our eyes met for just a second before he turned and disappeared down the stairs. I grabbed Nina's arm and pointed, but he was already gone. Mr. Kelsey asked what I saw, and I told him Derek was here, that he was the one who sent the message. The hallway was chaos, with students streaming toward the exits and teachers trying to maintain order while the alarm screamed overhead. Mr. Kelsey pulled out his phone and called 911 right there in the hallway while keeping us moving toward the nearest exit. He was explaining the situation to the dispatcher when we heard the first crash of breaking glass somewhere on the first floor. Students started screaming and running, and the orderly evacuation turned into a stampede. Nina and I got separated from our class in the crush of bodies all trying to squeeze through the same exit at once. Someone shoved me from behind, and I almost fell, but caught myself on the doorframe. When I looked back, I'd lost sight of Mr. Kelsey and most of my classmates. Outside in the courtyard, it was complete pandemonium. The alarm was still going off, and teachers were shouting conflicting instructions, with some telling students to gather at evacuation points, while others yelled to run to the parking lot. I spotted Nina near the flagpole and pushed through the crowd to reach her. She was crying and saying we needed to find her younger brother Jeremy, who had math class in the building where we'd heard the glass breaking. I told her the police were coming and we should stay where we were, but she wasn't listening. She took off running toward the math building, and I had no choice but to follow her because I wasn't going to let her go alone. We cut across the grass toward the side entrance of the math building, while other students were running in the opposite direction. Nina was faster than me and reached the door first. She yanked it open, and we slipped inside into a hallway that was eerily empty and silent except for the muted alarm. The lights were flickering, and there were papers scattered on the floor where someone had dropped their backpack. Nina called out for Jeremy, but her voice just echoed off the lockers. We moved down the hallway, checking classroom windows, and that's when we saw the blood. Just a few drops on the tile floor leading toward the stairwell. Nina made a sound in her throat and started following the blood trail before I could stop her. I hissed at her to wait because we didn't know what we were walking into, but she kept moving forward. The blood drops got bigger as we approached the stairwell, and then we saw him. A security guard was slumped against the wall at the bottom of the stairs, with blood spreading across his shirt. Nina screamed, and I clamped my hand over her mouth, pulling her back behind the corner. The guard's radio was crackling with voices asking for his status, but he wasn't moving. I had my phone out and was about to call 911 when I heard footsteps above us on the stairs. Heavy boots coming down slowly and deliberately. Nina's eyes went huge, and we both pressed ourselves flat against the wall, holding our breath. Derek appeared at the top of the stairs holding something that looked like a metal pipe. His face was blank and calm, which was somehow scarier than if he'd looked angry. He walked past the injured guard without even glancing down and continued into the hallway, heading away from where we were hidden. As soon as he turned the corner, I pulled Nina back the way we'd come, moving as quietly as possible. She was shaking so hard I thought she might collapse. I got us into an empty classroom and locked the door from the inside. Through the window, I could see police cars arriving in the parking lot with their lights flashing. Nina grabbed my phone and texted her brother asking where he was and if he was okay. The response came back almost immediately, saying he was locked in a supply closet with his teacher and 4 other students. He said they'd heard someone breaking windows, and his teacher had hidden them. Nina asked what room, and he sent back room 237, which was 2 floors up in the same building we were in. Nina looked at me and said we had to go get him because what if Derek found that classroom? I told her absolutely not because the police were here now and they'd clear the building. We could hear sirens outside and someone with a megaphone announcing that this was the police. Nina wasn't listening to reason, though. She said Jeremy was 12 years old and terrified, and she wasn't leaving him trapped in this building with a psychopath. I tried to physically stop her, but she pulled away and unlocked the classroom door. She looked out into the hallway and then took off running toward the stairwell. I cursed and followed her because I couldn't let her go alone, even though every instinct was screaming at me to stay hidden. We made it to the stairwell and started climbing as quickly as we could while trying to stay quiet. At the second-floor landing, we heard voices and froze. It was Derek talking to someone, and he sounded almost conversational. He was saying something about how nobody took him seriously until now, and they'd all remember his name after today. I peeked around the corner and saw him standing outside a classroom talking through the door to whoever was inside. He had the metal pipe raised and was hitting it against the door frame, making loud banging sounds that echoed through the empty hallway. He was telling them to open up because he just wanted to talk to Melissa. That was Derek's ex-girlfriend who'd broken up with him 3 months ago. He kept saying he wasn't going to hurt anyone if they just let him see her for 5 minutes. A teacher's voice from inside the classroom said Melissa wasn't in there and Derek needed to leave before the police came. Derek laughed and said the police were already here, but they'd never find him in time because this school had 100 rooms and he knew every hiding spot. He slammed the pipe against the door again, and I heard someone inside crying. Nina pulled on my sleeve and pointed up the stairs toward the 3rd floor where Jeremy was hiding. We started moving again, climbing higher while Derek was distracted with that classroom. My legs felt like rubber, and my heart was hammering so hard I thought Derek might hear it. We reached the 3rd floor, and Nina checked her phone for Jeremy's message. Room 237 was at the end of the hall past the library. We crept along, staying low and checking every corner. The lights were off up here, making it harder to see. We found room 237, and Nina knocked quietly, saying it was her, and Jeremy needed to open the door. We heard movement inside and then Jeremy's voice asking if she was alone. Nina said she had one friend with her, and they needed to hurry. The door unlocked and Jeremy appeared looking scared, but unharmed. His teacher, Mr. Walsh, stood behind him with 4 other students all crammed into what looked like a storage closet full of art supplies. Mr. Walsh asked if we knew what was happening, and I told him about Derek and the injured security guard. His face went gray, and he asked if the police were clearing the building yet. I said I didn't know, but we'd heard them arrive. One of the students in the closet started crying harder and saying she wanted to go home. Mr. Walsh told everyone to stay calm and we'd wait for the police to come get us. Nina said we couldn't wait because Derek might come up here and find us. We needed to get out while he was distracted on the 2nd floor. Mr. Walsh hesitated, but then nodded and said we'd move as a group to the nearest exit. There was an emergency stairwell at the back of the building that led directly outside. We filed out of the storage closet with Mr. Walsh leading and me bringing up the rear. The hallway felt like it stretched on forever with every shadow looking like Derek might jump out. We were halfway to the emergency exit when my phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. I can see you on the security cameras. 3rd floor? Keep moving and I won't follow. My blood turned to ice because that meant Derek was watching us somehow. I showed Mr. Walsh the message and his face went white. He pushed the students faster toward the emergency exit, while I looked around for security cameras. I spotted one mounted in the corner near the library and realized Derek must have accessed the security office. He could see the entire school from there. We reached the emergency exit, and Mr. Walsh slammed the push bar, opening the door. An alarm started blaring even louder than the fire alarm, adding to the chaos. We spilled out onto a metal fire escape and started climbing down as fast as we could. Jeremy slipped on the wet metal, and Nina caught him before he fell. Below us in the parking lot, I could see police officers in tactical gear, surrounding the building with weapons drawn. Someone spotted us on the fire escape and started shouting for us to hurry. We hit the ground, and officers rushed forward, creating a barrier between us and the building. They hustled us across the parking lot to where ambulances were lined up and paramedics were waiting. One of them wrapped a blanket around Nina, even though it wasn't cold. Another checked us for injuries and asked what we'd seen inside. I told them about Derek and the security guard and the security cameras. A detective in a suit wrote everything down in a notebook and asked if I still had the text messages. I showed him my phone and he photographed the screen. He asked how Derek got my number and I realized I had no idea. We'd never been friends, and I'd never given him my contact information. The detective asked if I'd posted my number on social media, or if Derek could have gotten it from a class directory. I said maybe from the student directory that got sent out at the beginning of the year. He made a note and said they were going to need to keep my phone as evidence, but he'd get it back to me in a few days. More students were being escorted out of the building now, including some who looked injured. I saw a girl with blood on her shirt being loaded into an ambulance and teachers with torn clothing looking shell-shocked. Nina grabbed my arm and asked if I thought Derek had hurt those people or if they'd been injured in the panic. I didn't know what to say because both options were terrible. The tactical team entered the building through multiple points, and we could hear them shouting commands over their radios. The detective told us to move further back behind the police line for our safety. My mom called my phone right before the detective took it, and I managed to answer telling her I was okay and outside with the police. She was crying and saying she was trying to get to the school, but they'd closed all the roads. I told her I loved her and then had to hand my phone over. The detective gave me a card with his number and said I could call him from my mom's phone later if I remembered anything else important. Nina's parents arrived somehow, having gotten through the roadblock, and she ran to them with Jeremy. I stood there alone watching the school surrounded by armed police. An officer escorted me to a tent they'd set up as a command center and told me to wait there until my parents arrived. Inside the tent were other students, all looking traumatized and wrapped in blankets. I recognized some of them, but nobody was talking much. We all just stared at our hands or at the ground, trying to process what had happened. Through the tent opening, I could see news vans arriving and setting up cameras. A reporter was doing a stand-up with the school in the background while police officers moved in and out of the building. One of the students in the tent started crying and saying she'd seen Derek hit someone with the pipe in the hallway. She said the person had fallen and Derek had just stepped over them and kept walking. A crisis counselor came into the tent and tried to get us talking about our feelings, but nobody wanted to engage. What were we supposed to say? That we were terrified and angry and confused about why this was happening? That we'd all known Derek was dangerous, but the school had just expelled him and hoped that would solve the problem? The counselor gave up after a few minutes and just sat with us in silence, which was somehow more comforting. My dad finally arrived, and I saw him arguing with an officer at the perimeter before they let him through. He ran to the tent and pulled me into a hug so tight I couldn't breathe. He kept asking if I was hurt, and I kept saying no, even though I felt like my insides had been shredded. They finally let us leave around 6 that evening after we'd all given statements to the police. The school was still surrounded by tactical teams, and I heard someone say they hadn't found Derek yet. He was still somewhere inside the building, and they were going room by room searching for him. My dad drove me home, and my mom was waiting in the driveway. She hugged me and cried and kept touching my face like she needed to confirm I was real. My little sister Amber stood in the doorway looking scared, and I realized she'd spent the whole day not knowing if I was alive or dead. Inside the house felt wrong somehow, too quiet and normal when everything else was chaos. My parents made me eat soup even though I wasn't hungry, and then said I should try to rest. I went upstairs and turned on the news. Every channel was covering the situation at my school. They were calling it an active hostage situation, even though I hadn't seen any hostages. They said the injured security guard had been transported to the hospital in critical condition, and multiple students had been hurt in the evacuation. The reporter said police were still searching for the suspect, who was believed to be armed and dangerous. They showed a photo of Derek from last year when he'd been on the soccer team. He looked normal in the picture, just a regular kid smiling at the camera. The reporter was talking about warning signs and school security failures, and I wanted to throw something at the TV. My phone buzzed with texts from classmates all asking if I was okay and what I'd seen. Nina sent a long message thanking me for helping her find Jeremy and saying she didn't know what she would have done without me. I didn't feel like I'd done anything heroic. I'd just followed her because she was my best friend, and I couldn't let her go alone. Another text came through from a number I didn't recognize. "They're getting close. You helped them find me. I won't forget that." I stared at the message feeling sick. Derek was texting me again, even though the police had my phone. Then I realized he must have sent it before they took it, and I was just seeing it now on my laptop, where my messages synced. I called the detective whose card I'd kept and told him about the new message. He said they'd trace it and asked me not to respond. He said Derek was trying to scare me and I shouldn't engage with him. But it was working because I was terrified. The idea that Derek was somewhere in my school watching security cameras and sending me threatening messages made my skin crawl. The detective said they had officers stationed outside my house and Derek wouldn't be able to get to me. That didn't make me feel better because it meant they thought he might try. I asked if they'd found him yet, and the detective paused before saying they'd located him barricaded in the school library and were attempting to negotiate his surrender. I turned the TV volume up, and sure enough, the news was reporting that police had made contact with the suspect. A hostage negotiator was on site trying to talk him out. The reporter said Derek was alone in the library and claiming to have explosives, though police hadn't confirmed that. My mom came upstairs and tried to get me to turn off the news, but I couldn't look away. I needed to know what happened. Needed to know if the security guard survived, and if any students were seriously hurt, and if Derek would face consequences for terrorizing our entire school. The standoff continued for another 3 hours, with police trying to convince Derek to come out peacefully. Finally, around 11 that night, the news reported that the suspect had surrendered and was in custody. I watched them bring Derek out in handcuffs surrounded by a dozen officers. He looked small and pathetic, stumbling to the police car. Nothing like the menacing figure I'd seen in the hallway with the pipe. The news reporter said charges would include assault with a deadly weapon, making terrorist threats, and attempted murder depending on the security guard's condition. I finally turned off the TV and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I saw Derek standing at the end of the hallway staring at me. I kept checking my laptop for messages, even though I knew he was in custody and couldn't send anything. My brain wouldn't shut off replaying everything that happened and thinking about what could have gone worse. The next morning, my parents said school was canceled for the rest of the week, while police processed the crime scene. They scheduled me an appointment with a therapist for that afternoon. I spent the morning reading news articles about the attack. The security guard, Ronald Davies, was in stable condition after emergency surgery. 3 students had been injured during the evacuation with broken bones and 1 concussion, but nothing life-threatening. The police found the pipe Derek had used and confirmed he'd smashed windows and assaulted Ronald, but hadn't actually had any explosives. The library barricade was just him piling up tables and chairs. Prosecutors were charging him as an adult, even though he was only 17. The therapy appointment was awkward, with the counselor asking how I felt, and me not knowing how to articulate the jumble of fear and anger and relief in my chest. She said it was normal to have trouble sleeping and eating after a traumatic event. She taught me breathing exercises that were supposed to help with anxiety. I went through the motions, but felt disconnected from my own body. That night, I dreamed Derek found me hiding in the classroom, and I woke up screaming. My dad came running and sat with me until I calmed down. He said I didn't have to go back to school if I wasn't ready, but I told him I couldn't hide forever. Eventually, I'd have to face the place where it happened. The school reopened the following Monday with increased security and metal detectors at every entrance. Walking through those doors felt like the hardest thing I'd ever done. Everything looked the same, but felt completely different. Students clustered in groups talking in low voices, and teachers watched us with worried expressions. They'd set up a memorial in the main hallway with flowers and cards for Ronald Davies. Someone had started a fundraiser for his medical bills. During first period, our principal came on the intercom and gave a speech about resilience and coming together as a community. He said counselors were available and we should ask for help if we needed it. He didn't mention Derek's name once. Nina found me at lunch and we sat together, not really eating, just picking at our food. She said her parents were considering transferring her and Jeremy to a different school. She asked if I'd thought about leaving too. I admitted the idea had crossed my mind, but this was my senior year, and I'd worked hard to get where I was. I didn't want Derek to take that away from me. Nina nodded and said she felt the same way, but her parents were scared. We talked about starting a student safety committee to push for better security measures. Maybe Derek's attack could lead to actual changes that would prevent something like this from happening again. It felt good to channel the fear into something productive. The detective called me that week and said they needed me to testify at Derek's preliminary hearing. He explained it was just to establish probable cause for trial, and I'd only have to answer a few questions. I agreed, even though the thought of seeing Derek again made me nauseous. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and I spent that time preparing with the prosecutor. She was a serious woman named Diana Foster, who specialized in assault cases. She walked me through what questions she'd ask and what the defense might ask. She said to stick to the facts and not speculate about Derek's motivations. Just describe what I saw and what happened. The day of the hearing, I dressed in nice clothes, and my dad drove me to the courthouse. The building was old and intimidating with marble floors and high ceilings. Diana Foster met us in the hallway and walked us to the courtroom. Inside, Derek sat at the defense table with his lawyer. He looked different, wearing a dress shirt and slacks with his hair cut short. When I walked past him, he didn't look up. I took the witness stand and was sworn in. Diana started with easy questions about who I was and my relationship to Derek. I said we went to the same school but weren't friends. She asked me to describe what happened on the day in question, starting with the text message. I told the court about the threatening text and showing it to Nina and Mr. Kelsey. I described seeing Derek in the hallway and the evacuation chaos. I explained going back into the building to find Nina's brother and discovering Ronald Davies injured. I described hearing Derek talking through the classroom door, threatening to hurt people if they didn't let him see his ex-girlfriend. Diana asked if Derek had been holding a weapon, and I said yes, a metal pipe. She showed me a photo and asked if this was the pipe I'd seen. I confirmed it was. Derek's lawyer stood up to cross-examine and asked if I'd actually seen Derek hit anyone with the pipe. I said no, I hadn't witnessed an assault, just saw him holding it, and saw Ronald injured. The lawyer asked if it was possible Ronald had been hurt during the evacuation panic, rather than by Derek. I said it was possible, but unlikely given the blood trail and the pipe. He asked if I'd been frightened during the events, and if my memory might be affected by trauma. Diana objected, and the judge sustained it. The lawyer sat down, looking frustrated. The judge asked if there were any other questions, and when no one responded, he thanked me and let me step down. The hearing lasted another hour with other witnesses, including Ronald Davies, who testified via video from the hospital. He confirmed Derek had attacked him when he tried to stop Derek from entering the building through a side entrance. The judge ruled there was sufficient evidence for trial. Derek's trial was set for 6 months later. In the meantime, I tried to return to normal life. I focused on my college applications and keeping my grades up. Nina and I started the Student Safety Committee and presented proposals to the school board about updating security protocols and hiring more trained personnel. Some board members were receptive, while others worried about costs. We organized student walkouts to demand action and got media coverage that put pressure on the administration. Slowly, things started changing. The school hired actual security officers with law enforcement backgrounds and installed a better camera system. It felt like a small victory, pulled from something terrible. The trial finally arrived and lasted 4 days. I testified again, giving the same account I'd given at the preliminary hearing. Other students testified about Derek's threatening behavior before his expulsion and text messages he'd sent to his ex-girlfriend. The prosecution built a case showing premeditation and intent to cause harm. Derek's defense team argued he'd had a mental breakdown due to the stress of his expulsion and breakup. They brought in a psychiatrist who testified Derek showed signs of depression and anxiety. The prosecutor countered with her own expert saying depression didn't excuse violence, and Derek had made clear choices to arm himself and target specific people. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Derek was convicted of assault with a deadly weapon, making terrorist threats, and attempted murder for the attack on Ronald. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month. Ronald Davies gave a victim impact statement describing how the attack had changed his life. He'd been a security guard for 15 years without ever being seriously hurt. Now, he had permanent nerve damage in his shoulder and chronic pain. He said Derek had stolen his sense of safety and peace of mind. Derek's parents spoke, asking for leniency, and saying their son needed treatment, not punishment. Derek himself gave a short statement apologizing and saying he'd been in a dark place, but knew that wasn't an excuse. The judge sentenced Derek to 18 years in prison with possibility of parole after 12. He said the sentence reflected the serious nature of the crimes and the trauma Derek had inflicted on the entire school community. He noted Derek's age and mental health issues as mitigating factors, but said public safety had to be the priority. Derek was let out in handcuffs, and I felt a complicated mix of relief and sadness watching him go. Relief that he'd face consequences and couldn't hurt anyone else. Sadness, because this was someone my age whose life was essentially over because of choices he'd made in anger and pain. The system had failed him long before he picked up that pipe, but that didn't absolve him of responsibility for what he'd done. After the sentencing, I started slowly healing. The nightmares became less frequent, and I could walk through school without constantly looking over my shoulder. Nina and I stayed close, and our safety committee kept pushing for reforms. We spoke at other schools about our experience and what warning signs to watch for. Some people called us activists, but we just saw ourselves as survivors, trying to prevent other kids from going through what we had. Ronald Davies recovered enough to return to work part-time at a different school. He said he couldn't come back to our campus because of the memories, but he appreciated that students were fighting for better safety measures. I graduated that spring with Nina and most of our class. During the ceremony, the principal acknowledged what we'd been through and said our resilience had strengthened the entire community. It felt strange celebrating when the events of that day still felt so close. But moving forward was the only option. Derek remained in prison, and I tried not to think about him, though sometimes I wondered if he understood the ripples his actions had created, the fear he'd planted in hundreds of students, and the changes he'd forced our school to make. Whether any of it had been worth whatever momentary satisfaction he'd gotten from his rampage, I'd probably never know, because I never wanted to speak to him again. That chapter was closed, and I was focused on the future, refusing to let one day of terror define the rest of my life. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.